Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Karimikui AA Wash Processed Kenya from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Manhattan, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel a lot throughout the years. However, we have reviewed them a fair bit less often this year. And the main reason for that is because a lot of the multi-roasters nearby haven't been carrying their coffee as often. And as a result, I've had fewer opportunities to acquire their coffee. That being said, Manhattan still has my favorite wash-processed Kenyan coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel, which was of course the Kion Jege from a couple of years ago. And despite the fact that they've gone through a number of changes since that coffee, I definitely felt it would be worth revisiting one of their other Kenyan offerings. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I knew this was going to be an interesting discussion point, as I've actually heard some mixed impressions of their roasting profile since the change from the Probat to the Typhoon, as a lot of people have described it as being a little bit more developed, but I've also heard from somebody that's pretty notable in the coffee industry that technically they roast lighter now than they did when they were roasting on the Probat. That being said, a lot of people describe the development of their coffees as being somewhat reminiscent of a matter of concrete, which is probably a little bit more developed, but these coffees do look relatively light. And in addition to that, they do act a little bit more developed than they used to. Hopefully, I know that's kind of tricky to describe this profile, but for me, I feel like the best way to kind of align that is somewhere between a matter of concrete's coffees and somewhere between the majority of Fried Hat's coffees. So that's kind of the impression I get of the roast profile now. Hopefully that gives you a good idea, but with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And the cup itself does have some nice Kenyan attributes, as there's plenty of the listed and expected citric qualities to complement the classic bright tart berry components. Depth as the coffee does cool down, as there's a sugary sweetness and a slight stone fruit-like sense with a slight bitterness in line with the listed vanilla. So for the most part, I took away that this was a pretty positive first impression of this coffee. Definitely plenty of depth, especially for a wash-processed Kenyan coffee. Day 17 through the Chemex, and the coffee is continuing to perform above expectations, primarily in terms of the sweetness, as it does offer a fair bit of sugariness. Citric qualities shining through a bit more today in a slightly bitter sense. So once again, a lot of different aspects to this one, given that it is a Kenyan coffee. Day 20 through the April brewer, and the cup does continue to perform a bit above expectations, as it continues to offer plenty of sweetness and clarity, void of too much savoriness, rather a sharper focus on the listed citric attributes of lime and vanilla with the bitterness. It is pretty well defined overall, and a lot of these first couple of impressions have been a little bit, I would say, outside of what I was necessarily expecting from this coffee. I think I was much more expecting it to be just a very Kenyan-like coffee in general, but it's just been a little different, with the primary focus being a little bit away from those really bright red berry aspects. Day 23 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and it's not quite as good as off brew. There's a little bit of a heightened bitterness to the cup, while it does offer a slight bit less of the sweetness. It does continue to remain a bit more citric focused this time around, so that once again continues to remain a little bit of an anomaly with this coffee. Day 26 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's also struggling from the same issues as the previous day, with less sweetness and a heightened bitterness in the citric sense. Overall intensity is down, as there's a little bit more of the savoriness, but also a nicer vanilla aspect within the cool down. So getting some overall mixed impressions within this coffee at this point. Day 29 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee is back to the best it has been to this point, as it's a bit more reminiscent of some of the earlier experiences, but it doesn't necessarily feel like this coffee does particularly well with the higher extraction adjustments, as there's better definition to the florality and sweetness in this time around. Otherwise, notably more of the citric tones as well, and you probably noticed that I haven't necessarily highlighted a lot of the bright red tart berry aspects of this one, mostly because for the majority of the time, once again, they weren't necessarily the most abundant quality within it. Day 32 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it continues to have mixed results, as off brew it's just okay, offering a more faint Kenyan-like experience, but the cool down itself does yield significantly better results with a sweeter vanilla tone and a heightened citric component. Day 35 through the V60, and it's back to the best, though there's a bit more savoriness this time around, mostly in the intermediary. Off brew, there is it's bright with a bit of floral vanilla before cooling down into a more rounded coffee with plenty of the tart berries and citric aspects, a slightly sugary stone fruit as well. So this time around, I'm feeling a little bit more of those Kenyan-like aspects. So I feel like maybe this coffee is possibly opening up on this day 35 mark, as on day 41, it was a little bit more similar to that experience as well. So this coffee may have just taken a little bit of time to kind of transition into something a little bit different. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And that's probably the most important thing to discuss with this coffee, because it's not too often, especially when the savoriness is as high as it is, that we do score a Kenyan coffee at that level 4 mark. But I do have to say that this one was pretty well defined in the other aspects, so that vanilla, that slight stone fruit, that citric quality, and given that it wasn't too savory for the majority of the time that we were drinking it, I feel like it was pretty hard to kind of knock the overall cleanliness of this one. So level 4 was the best and most ideal place to put it. Finish and acidity, I usually discuss those two things side by side when discussing Kenyan coffees, and that's no surprise in this one either. But though I do have to say that the finish at that level 4, while it is definitely there, it didn't necessarily come in as much of the red berry aspects as, or even the savoriness, as a lot of other Kenyan coffees do. Interestingly, this one finished off on a much more citric tone, and even at times a little bit more of that vanilla-like sweetness. So that's a bit of an anomaly, and I would have to say that it acted pretty different from the Kenyan coffees in the same way that the brightness did, because a lot of the time it didn't necessarily achieve the same level of brightness that I usually associate with a lot of Kenyan coffees. So those two things, while they still did reach that level 4 mark, they were a little close to not even getting to that point. So that in itself is pretty interesting with this coffee. Sweetness, level 4, and it's probably on the lower side of level 4, and a lot of that sweetness did come from the more floral aspects, that floral vanilla-like component within this one. Outside of that, I do have to say that the citric fruit within this one did have a little bit of sweetness to kind of add to that as well, and also that slight stone fruit component. So there's enough to just push it there at that level 4 mark, but those three things at the top of that tasting wheel all barely made it to level 4, which in itself is kind of interesting. Florality, level 4. And this one I feel like is completely in line with the vanilla component, because I was kind of surprised that it was as prominent as it was within this coffee. I can't quite recall too many Kenyan coffees having this strong of that characteristic, though it has been a little bit more prominent in some of the Kenyan coffees that we've reviewed this year versus years past. Move on, berry fruit, level 4, and that's another one that actually barely reached that level 4 mark. If I recall correctly, I don't think that they have any sort of berry note descriptor on this coffee, but it still has a little bit of those bright currant aspects to it, though certainly not as prominent as with the majority of Kenyan coffees that we do review. So that one is also barely there at that level 4 mark. Citrus fruit, level 4, truth be told, that's the most prominent component within this one, as there's plenty of the listed lime throughout the entirety of this coffee, so that one is definitely justified there at that level 4 mark. We move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the stone fruit, level 3. And as I mentioned, there's a slight bit of that sugary stone fruit aspect. I think they have an apricot note listed on here, which once again would make a fair bit of sense. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was anywhere near as abundant as some of the other characteristics in this coffee, a little bit more medium of a sense to it. We move on to the savoriness, level 3. And that's a little bit more, I would say, of some like tea-like aspects to this one, as opposed to necessarily being a true tomato-like characteristic. And I'd have to say that for the majority of the time drinking this coffee, there was hardly any of those savory aspects to it. I'm looking at this and I'm still wondering how it reached that level 3 mark. I think maybe 2 is a bit more apt for it, but even then we do have it on this tasting wheel, so sometimes I look at the tasting wheel and say I kind of disagree with it. Level 3 seems a little high, but I could probably see it that 2.5 range, and we probably bumped it up because it was feeling a little bit more savory this time around than days past. And then final thing worth discussing, body, level 3. It certainly has a fair bit of that juicy Kenyan medium body-like aspect to it, which was fully expected, especially given the brew method that we opted for with this coffee. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I will start with this and say that I did make it a point to grab at least a couple of Manhattan's coffees before we do our European coffee roaster tier list. Or I should say that I'm going to try to make it a point, because this is the only one that I picked up from Manhattan recently. So I'm hoping to get at least one more coffee in from them to kind of gauge where I want to put them on that tier list, because truth be told, I am going to change our placement from the last time we did place them on our European coffee roaster tier list, because I feel like a lot of the changes that they've gone through haven't necessarily been in line with my own preferences. And this coffee right here, I think it was fine. Like I don't necessarily think that it's anywhere near some of the coffees that I've had from Manhattan in the past, and most notably the Kianjege. I mean, that was a very special coffee. Though this one right here, I do have to say, slightly exceeded my expectations, given that a lot of the times when I'm having a sample here or there, or when I'm trying a cup of coffee from Manhattan here or there, it hasn't necessarily been my favorite. So this one has performed a little better than those. But even then, when you're trying to compare it to a lot of the coffees that you've had from Manhattan in the past, I don't necessarily think I enjoy it as much. But those coffees that Manhattan did release once upon a time were very special gems. And this one right here, I think maybe it's probably a victim of some very high expectations or familiarity with this coffee roaster. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, honestly, it's a little different than the average Kenyan coffee, and that's the biggest takeaway I had from this one, was because it didn't necessarily always reach the level 4 in terms of the finish, the brightness, or even the red berry aspect, so it didn't always act like a Kenyan coffee. I feel like on some days you probably could have mixed this in with some interesting coffees from other origins, like even Honduras or so, and it probably would have been able to trip me up to a certain extent, because it wouldn't have necessarily stood out as overly Kenyan-like compared to some other coffees in general. So that's the first place I want to start, but probably the focus on the vanilla-like sweetness. This one was kind of unique in that regard, especially for a Kenyan coffee. And then outside of that, I do have to say, if you do enjoy your lime-like aspects, because that was also a very prominent component within this one, but I think that's probably the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Karimikui AA Wash Processed Kenya from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.